Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we are going to play with a new type of potting mix for orchids, which you might have seen in other videos recently, because I am kind of using it a lot with some orchids. Now, one of the reasons why I want to test out this mixture is because from time to time I do get comments from you asking me what is a good alternative to sphagnum moss. I do understand that in some parts of the world, good sphagnum moss is hard to find. I don't have an easy time finding this either. So I'm really interested to finding a sort of replacement for it which might be more available. And I do believe coco peat is much more available globally than good quality sphagnum moss. So I'm interested in finding a good mixture for, let's say, most orchids with coco peat, if that's even possible. If you're from Europe, you might know that many Oncidium type orchids come potted in this coco peat mixture, and it's not really the best in many cases. And this is because I believe that for home growing, we need a little bit of a mixture, not just straight coco peat. So I want to test out with a few orchids and a few setups. But before we go ahead, let me just stress out that this is not a tutorial. I don't have any experience with this mixture. I'm trying it out. It can go very bad. It can go very, very well. As a YouTuber, I always prefer to have hands-on experience with what I'm talking about rather than talk from imagination or whatever I read on the internet. But if you ever want to test out anything anybody does on the internet, please do so on one orchid first. See how things work out. They may not work out, so be mindful of that. And with that said, don't forget to give this video a like if you do end up enjoying it, and why not subscribe? I post 3 times a week. So let's go ahead and look at the orchids we're going to work with today and the setups. So the 2 orchids that I will pot today are 2 Oncidium types. This is my Sotoanum, which suffered a lot from some insect damage, but I think he's quite okay now. And this is my Alisara tahoma, nope, it's the Eurostar, sorry about that, which needed to be repotted anyway because I did not repot it since I purchased it. So I went ahead and cleaned up the root system, sprayed it with hydrogen peroxide, did all of the preparations so that we can actually focus on the setups. One of the setups will be your typical transparent plastic pot with some drainage holes and also some ventilation holes. It is pretty much the setup that I use for most of my orchids, but with sphagnum moss and bark chips. And the second setup will be with an unglazed terracotta pot. I want to try out both of these setups because they both work just a little bit different. For example, you know that in my plastic pots, I typically put a layer of sphagnum moss at the bottom. And this is because it absorbs the water left in the tray and distributes it throughout the pot. Will this happen with my coco peat mixture, which of course is uniform? I don't know, but I do want to test it out. It's pretty much about the layering issue, which you might already know if you're growing orchids in bark. Now, with an unglazed terracotta pot, this does not happen because this pot is very, very wicking. So if I have water at the bottom, the pot itself will drag it all the way to the top. And not only that, it will wet the medium inside as well. So these pots might actually work very, very differently with this mixture. When it comes to bark and sphagnum moss, I know how to manage this and how to control it, but with this stuff, I don't know. I need to try it out. Additionally to these 2 orchids, I also have my vanilla orchid potted in a clay pot with a top layer of bark. I use the top layer just because I typically don't like how the perlite looks after a while, but that tends to happen in soil, not in coco peat. So for the Oncidiums, I will not add a top layer. Also, we have a Phragmipedium in a self-watering pot. Now, this is a pot without extra ventilation holes. It is plastic, and it solely relies on the medium's capacity to wick water. All that drags the water from the reservoir to the medium is a little piece of thread. So it's going to be very interesting to see if this particular medium performs in self-watering. I know sphagnum moss performs, but I do want to see what happens with coco peat. And of course, if I have other orchids available to do tests with, I will continue to add them to the project as we go on in the updates, but for now, I think we're good. Now, let's talk a little bit about what this mixture contains. So of course, the main ingredient that we have here is coco peat. As I was saying, I'm using the IKEA one, which produces, I believe, 8 liters of coco peat after you hydrate it. But you can actually find coco peat at pet shops as well. It is very used in terrariums, vivariums. Then I mixed it with bark chips and I use the same bark as I always do. I'm using the Zoo Mid Repti bark. We're seeing a trend here. The pet shop is a great place for orchid supplies, and also some perlite, which I got at the garden center. When it comes to ratios, I'm not super sure about it because I tend to be a visual person. I have so many orchids and all of them need just a little bit of a different medium and arrangement. So I rely on the visual, but I would say that I used maybe 70% cocoa peat and the rest 30% is split equally between the bark and the perlite, maybe just a little bit more bark, until it looks like it's very airy, very well draining, and it doesn't form clumps. The aim is to obtain a water retentive and wicking potting mix that will not suffocate roots. And since cocoa peat is finer than sphagnum moss, I do want to make sure that I have enough drainage and aeration material. Now, one of these two orchids, I'm not sure which one, will also have some activated charcoal, which again, I purchased from the pet shop. Now, I want to test it out because I have actually never used activated charcoal. So I want to see if there will be difference in the pots with charcoal and the pots without. So first, I will pot the Oncidium soroanum in the transparent plastic pot, and you know what? I will be using the charcoal in this pot. So with this mixture, it doesn't matter which layer you add first because it's all identical. So I'm just gonna put a layer on the bottom and then arrange my orchid in the pot, just like a normal repotting, and then just add the mixture around the roots. I failed. I forgot to add the charcoal, so I had to dump out part of the medium just so I could add the charcoal as well. I'm not used to using it. And there we go, my Oncidium is all potted up. It looks good, but I'm nervous. It's so fine. But hey, we'll see how this goes. So I'm gonna go run some water through the pot, put it in a decorative container, you know, the usual. Okay, now time for the Bullara. And there we go, my orchids are done. Now, one of the things that I couldn't test now is the wicking capacity in comparison to sphagnum moss. And this is because the cocoa peat that I buy from IKEA needs to be hydrated in order to work with it. So my cocoa peat was already damp. However, I will try to wait until it becomes fairly dry and then do some layering tests, which I will add to this video. As you can see in this pot, I have quite a lot of perlite at the surface. I'm really curious to see if it stays white-ish or it starts to be covered by algae or gets tannin stain. So we're gonna see how things go. I will pick up this video when I can do more testing. All right, you guys, so it's been about a week and I have thoughts to share with you. So first off, let's just take the Oncidium soroanum, which I potted in my typical plastic pot, yeah honey, with ventilation holes. You might hear my girls sing a lot in this video. They're in there, you know, that time when they're very cuddly. All right, so first off, I can tell you that the amount of time in which this pot dried out was very comparable to the amount of time it takes my typical pots to dry out, which means that I got the ratio right for my climate. If I would use this in my green room, that's the exact ratio I would use. However, of course, this will have to depend on your environment, just like the bark and sphagnum moss ratio needs to depend on your environment and the orchid you're gonna use. And with this one, I think you can go the same way, as in use less cocoa peat and more of the other materials if your environment is not prone to getting dry all that fast. If it is prone to getting dry, then obviously more cocoa peat will retain more water. Then I tried out the wicking capacities of this medium, and behold, I was shocked. It does actually wick quite similarly to sphagnum moss. It's not identical, but it is similar. So I placed my pot in a basin of water and instantly I could see the water climb up the walls of the pot. Now I let the pot sit in that water for a couple of hours, 3 hours, and in the end the water did reach the top. So in this regard, it did actually work like sphagnum moss. And you can see even today, and by the way, I did the experiment last night, you can see that the pot is still wet at the top. You can see the color difference. However, though, when it comes to layering, this is not identical to sphagnum moss. You can see even by looking at the pot that I have quite a lot more water at the bottom here. Now, is it as abrupt as with only bark? No, certainly not. We do have moisture here as well, but you can see we have a degree of layering, which in my opinion, it is workable, and you can actually diminish this by adding maybe a more aerated medium at the bottom, provided it's still wicking, it's still connected to the cocoa peat. There is a fine ratio you need to find there. However, let me show you how the situation looks like in a bark and sphagnum moss pot. So here I have my Dendrobium hibiki. I chose it just to show you that I have buds, and I'm very happy about it. But also, this one is potted in my typical mixture. Look at this. It is even throughout. There is pretty much almost no layering. Nothing visible anyway, and let me get you in a little closer. You can see that at the bottom, I don't have a very visible wetter layer. And this is the magic of the sphagnum moss, sadly, which in my opinion cannot be replicated so far. And you guys know I tried Synthic, I tried rock wool, I tried sponges. I did try some stuff, and apart for Ceramis, which has its drawbacks, I really didn't find anything identical to sphagnum moss. However, even so, I do believe that the cocoa peat mixture came pretty close. It also has a pro over sphagnum moss, one of the very few pros. Let me show you what I mean. So you might have noticed me mention that I'm starting a moss colony. Well, this is what I mean, the very tiny moss colony that I can gather. If I put the moss typically on sphagnum moss, I'm gonna get algae before the moss even starts to spread out, because I have a lot of algae spores in my environment. Well, cocoa peat does not actually attract and promote algae. Now look at my moss culture here. It is doing very, very nicely. It is growing nicely. Let me just expose a little bit the situation so you can see there are no algae. So for me, the greatest thing about the cocoa peat is that it does not attract algae. And you guys might know that the very reason why I put a top layer of bark on top of my sphagnum moss is to prevent algae, which are wild, just wild here. So very, very happy with this. And this brings me to my next setup. Here's my Phragmipedium in my self-watering pot. Now this setup is a little older. I pre-recorded that video actually. So I did study this setup for the past 2 weeks, and I can tell you that indeed this mixture does wick the water from the reservoir all the way to the top. Can we see? And the wicking mechanism is your typical wick system. Very, very typical self-watering pot. So it absolutely works. However, look at the top. Do you see that the perlite is already getting brown? This is tannin stain. I'll make a little parenthesis here because I did notice a few comments lately asking me what I feel about cork, because probably some sources might have said that cork is good for orchids because it contains tannins. Well, actually, all type of bark contains tannins. Yeah, some a little less than others. Cocoa peat and coconut husk contain quite a lot of tannin actually, which will leach out. And what you see here, the browning on the perlite, this is the tannin stain. So if you're already working with any type of bark, you don't need to add cork to add tannins if for some reason you want to add tannins. Okay, back to the setups here. So, because I would really not put a top layer on this since it has no ventilation, it's not even clay to breathe, I would rather put moss on top because I feel like it will spread and look absolutely fantastic, which I will do. I'll get a few strands that I'm already propagating. What I would do though is remove this bark and perlite from the surface, just add a very, very thin layer only of cocoa peat just to make things even and evenly moist. Put a little strands of moss and hey presto, I think it's gonna look great. I think it will not have algae, the pot will still breathe, and the moss will grow nicely. So that's very exciting. This is what I plan to do with this particular pot. It will just take a lot of time. And since we're kind of on the subject, let's also talk about the unseen face of orchid media, water parameters. We're just gonna test one right now. We're gonna test the pH. One of the things that makes sphagnum moss so good is the fact that it's slightly acidic. So we don't really need to struggle with any additives or things to improve the pH in order for the nutrients to be properly absorbed. And personally, one of my biggest beefs with Eleka, which let's say is one of the other media which could replace sphagnum moss, was the constant need for adjusting the pH. which drive me absolutely off the wall at some point. Not only did I have issues with the wicking capacity of leca here in my environment, but also with the pH. No, too much for me. Now, coconut husk, being that it is a bark, as you might expect, it is also quite acidic as well, typical and appropriate for orchid growing. I used reverse osmosis water, which is kind of neutral when it comes to pH, meaning very, very, very close to 7. So in this regard, yes, it is comparable to sphagnum moss, although moss is even more acidic than this. But anyway, it is not alkaline, which would be the worst case scenario. And it was actually the worst case scenario for leca and me. And I just couldn't do it anymore. So from this regard, coco peat is at a decent and suitable level for orchids. Of course, in time, as it degrades as well, it will get more and more and more acidic. It is said that degradation occurs slower than with sphagnum moss. I'm not going to add my input on this because I don't have one yet. I need to have experience first. I need to see which one degrades faster. Because yes, sphagnum moss does tend to degrade faster than other media, although the Best Grow brand that I use does indeed tend to degrade much slower than other brands. As for the clay pot setups, well, as expected, this one tends to dry out a little bit faster than the plastic pots, which for me is not necessarily the best of things. Obviously, if I want an A-rated setup, I might actually go for the clay rather than the plastic, depending if I have ventilation holes on the sides. It's not a bad setup, but for me, it's a little too hot here in my climate to rock a lot of these types of pots. However, I was pretty okay with these setups. I'm going to show you the vanilla. Vanilla is doing great. So this one, you can see the top is pretty dry, but if I stick my finger in the medium, I can still detect moisture. I obviously leave water in the tray for the pot to absorb and to distribute in the medium. If I wouldn't leave water in the tray, this would be a no-no for me. But with the vanilla, since I have this big dish, I use it as a reservoir and it works fantastic. It doesn't stress me out with watering, and as far as the quality of the media, it's good. Let me show you the root. So in the video that I just showed you, which happened about 2 weeks ago, maybe a little more, you might have noticed that this vanilla had a tiny little root, which I was hoping will grow in the medium. Well, it did. A lot. So let me show you how the root grew inside. Dun, 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 dun. Look how much it grew up until here. Up until here it grew. It grew very, very nice. Personally, I do still prefer the bark and sphagnum moss for the vast majority of my collection. It's just easier for me. I don't like sphagnum moss as a top layer at all. So I'm pretty excited to do that experiment with the moss. I do intend to use the coco peat mixture for probably the semi-terrestrials and terrestrials. It gives me a broader spectrum of type of videos that I can do as well, which is important for me. I will keep these orchids in these setups, obviously, just to see how they work in time. But yeah, personally, I do kind of still prefer sphagnum moss, but this is not bad. In the way that I mixed it, it works out very well for me. Keep in mind, you should always mix stuff to fit your environment and your orchid and, you know, the type of lifestyle you have. You don't have time to water your orchids, such as I, go for some magic tricks, go for some little basins, break the rules a little bit. It's fine, it's okay. But if you have a lot of time to water, make a mixture that is not so water retentive. It's a very flexible mixture though, so I'm pretty happy with the experiment. Yay, and I'm hoping that I managed to help you guys who are looking for an alternative. Coco peat is really available at pet shops, as I was saying, also IKEA. So alrighty guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video and this experiment. I'll keep you up to date. I will for sure run this setup with the vanilla. It's going great. Vanillas typically enjoy this type of setups. I will keep my Alessara in this setup as well, and we'll see how things evolve within a year, let's say. And with that said, I hope you guys have a great day. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, updates, and other fun orchid subjects. If you wish to support the channel, do consider becoming a member or visit the merch store linked down below in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It's always nice to stay in touch there as well. And I'll see you all next time. Bye!